Okay, so this is OpenID Connect in action smart presentation. Sorry for a bit delay, but we got the pizza, so we had to. Sorry for the guys who cannot participate on the pizza station, but that's one of the. That's why many people come here. So today, what I will be talking about, I will mention this presentation is split into the three main areas. First, I will talk some very basic principles of OpenID Connect. It's quite a big thing, so I will cover just the basic, but it should be enough to get you going. I will mention why we need it. Why do we need something like OpenID Connect in the day world? I will show very simple demo with Google. And then the second and third part of the presentation, I'll show two recommended flow, which should cover most of your scenarios. And I will show them like a first demo. I'll show with a single page application. It will be just a simple plain JavaScript, no framework. And API will be in ASP.NET Core. And as an identity provider, we use the identity server. I will say also some few things about the identity server. And the last part of the presentation is about client credential grounds. That's for machine-to-machine scenario, and it's it will be API to API in ASP.NET and Core, and again with the identity server. And yeah, it's a bit longer than 1 hour, so please feel free to leave about any other section if you're not interested anymore, because to go through that demo, I cannot do it within 1 hour. So I think like all three sections, each section is roughly half an hour. To guide you through the protocol of OpenID Connect, I prepared a demo. This demo should cover the most of the scenarios you can meet in your life when you're doing, and sorry, this is like one important thing is that all these components of the solution are running on internet. So it's not, you cannot use the like advantages when you're running the solution on internet network, but imagine that this is running like all these components are distributed applications on the internet. So in our scenario, you will have a single page client application. We will have a MVC client application, and there is quite a big difference between single page and MVC, because single page application runs completely on user browser. So any malicious hacker can do anything with your application. So in terms of security, it's much harder to secure a single page application. Then another type of the application, it's a classical web application which use the full postbacks. So in our case, that will be ASP.NET Core MVC. But with this type of application, you have a bit of advantage because part of your code is running on the server, and you can secure the server. And then you would have APIs, like first API would be called by the client application. And the second API, imagine it's some external API which is needed by the first API. And it will be classical machine-to-machine scenario. So with these demo sample, I can cover most of the needs you have. Single page application is actually also like a mobile application. It has roughly the same security constraints. So if we don't know anything about the ID Connect, or if OpenID Connect doesn't exist, how would you secure this scenario in past? Like, in past MVC client application, we could use the form based security. So it means this application had its own database of users. It stored the users, it stored the passwords, and used the cookie and forms to perform the authentication. With the API, again, if you were on internet, you couldn't use the internal security of the closed network. You would use typically basic authentication, like that means that you would send username, password with every request, and API would have to probably will need some internal database with these username passwords to check that you authorized to run it. So and with single-page application, I even don't know. I don't develop single-page applications, so I don't know how these were secured in past. Any other idea how to secure it without OpenID Connect? There were like some Windows Communication Foundation standards which tries to cover it, but that standard is pretty much dead because you have these days web APIs. So how would you secure this scenario on public? Well, I don't know anything else than what I said. So if you don't know anything else, so clearly these historical means are not a really good one, right? First, you have to take care of many things straight in your application, and second, like even if you take care of this, the solution is not really ideal. It's not very good to send username password with every request, for example. So how to sort this out? And I was thinking, and when I was learning it as well, I was thinking, like in many things in software, you can actually think about some real-life example, and you can find quite good parallel how it's sorted out in the real world, and that will help you to understand why OpenID Connect work as it works. So I actually was thinking about some real-time examples, and to get inspiration. And one example was when you go to bank to create, you want to open account in the bank. So the bank needs to know who you are. The bank needs to authenticate you, right? And now the bank doesn't have database of all the people in the country, doesn't have access to birth certificates or fingerprints or anything. They don't have it, and they cannot really authenticate who you are using their own means. So what they do, they actually get all the information from your national ID card, right? They don't need anything else because they just need to know who you are, and this information is on your ID card. But in order this to work, there must be some condition met. Like first, like the bank must trust the organization which issued the ID card, right? So that's the bank obviously trusts the Czech public services which issues the Czech national ID card. That for them it's a trustworthy issuer, so they trust it. And the issuer actually have to make sure that the ID card is protected against tampering. So if you get some ID card, you can produce your own, or you can easily change the existing one. So that's one situation when we need to know the authentication in real life. Now imagine another situation, like you're going to a rock concert or any concert, and this is slightly different because again, like at the security in the gate there will be security guys, and they just interested if you paid. And maybe if it's a concert which has a different sectors and you pay for different sectors, they interested for which sector you paid. They don't care who you are. They just interested if you authorize to enter, if you paid, and for which sector. So they can actually do the same thing. They don't have their own database of all people, and they don't try find in the database if you paid or not. They just happy if you show them the ticket, right? And they get all the information from the ticket, which sector you allow to go. And again, it's the same thing, like the security guys, they trust the ticket issuer, and the ticket issuer actually doesn't have to be organizers of the concert. It can be some external agency like Ticketstream. So just important thing is that the security guy know how the tickets looks like. They trust the organization which issued the ticket, and the ticket is protected against the tampering. So it's not easy to produce your own ticket and go to the concert, or pay for the cheapest ticket and then change the sector and go to the most expensive one. So this parallel we can actually use in the software as well. So you can actually delegate the authentication to external entity, to external component, which is called the identity provider in OpenID Connect. And the user deals, in terms of authentication, the user deals with the identity provider. And when the user authenticates, the identity provider will send to your application, it will send not ID card, but something called ID token. But it's complete parallel. The ID token contains the information about the user, which you need to know. And the same like in the real world, we must make sure that it's not easy to, or it's not possible to create the ID token on your own. Or if you get the ID token, it's not possible to change the information on that ID token. So when we go through the standard must make sure that these things are fulfilled. And in parallel with the concert, going to the concert, it's like you want to use some API, and typically the API is not interested who you are. They're not interested in authentication. They're interested in authorization. So they just want to know that you are authorized to access this API, which doesn't necessarily means they need to know who you are. And in OpenID Connect, this is called access token. So ID token is for the authentication, access token is for authorization. Yeah, and the same thing I do for another client application as well. The authentication is delegated to identity provider and get the token. And yeah, you see already the advantages that one big advantage is that your application don't have to take care of implementing users and passwords, which is normally quite hard, and you delegate it to specialized component, which can be your own, or you can use the external provider, right? One important thing, of course, is, and it's the same like in the real world, if someone steals the token, they can get the access to the service. It's the same like, if someone steals your ticket when you go to a concert, he can go to the concert, and the same applies here. So what you have to do is you have to protect the tokens from being stolen, and this is using SSL HTTPS. That's how it must be done, and it's actually mandatory to use HTTPS when you use the tokens, unless you are on some internal network, but on internal network you wouldn't need the tokens probably. So that was briefly how the OpenID Connect and how the OpenID Connect operates, and what's the idea behind it. One thing, I was not very exact in name of the standards here. Here I'm talking about OpenID Connect, but there are actually two standards. One is called OAuth 2, and OAuth 2 was the first one, but OAuth 2 is basically only about the authorization. It's only about access tokens, and it's an open standard for access delegation. It's designed for HTTP, for today's web API world. But it was only about access tokens and about getting access to the APIs. And that was the first standard. And it didn't say how authentication happened. So that's why some guys came with OpenID Connect, which is actually like a layer on top of OAuth 2. And it adds this missing bit, which is authentication. And it adds the identity token notion. In today's presentation, I will just be simple and call everything OpenID Connect. Sometimes I would mean OAuth 2, but I think for practical reasons, it's not really necessary to know what is the difference between these two. So, you just need to be aware that it's actually two standards. Before I say something about the standards, just quick terminology, because we will use this terminology throughout the presentation. So the identity provider, I already mentioned what identity provider is. It's an external component which implements the authentication and which issues the tokens. It implements OpenID Connect and OAuth 2. And the ID token, access token, I explained. That's actually the terminology from OpenID Connect as well. The applications which are facing the users, they called clients in the terminology, and the APIs which you need to protect, they called in these standards, they called a resource server. Meaning is that the API contains some resources which they serve to incoming requests, but they need authorization. They must be sure that you authorize, or the application which tries to use the resources is authorized to use these resources. So just before I tell a bit more about OpenID Connect, I actually show very simple example of Google. Most of the big companies like Google, Microsoft, Twitter, they actually use OpenID Connect for their own means. So when you want to, for example, when you want to access the Google Docs as an external application, you do it through OpenID Connect. So this is the scenario specialized for Google. Identity provider here is Google Accounts. I have some imaginary my SPA application, my single page application, and I want to access Google Docs. And Google Docs obviously doesn't want to serve the documents to everyone. They ask for the access token, and they authorize your access based on the access token. So now the first demo, most of the authentication, or pretty much every authentication involving user, starts with a redirect to authentication platform to IDP provider. And the standards will actually tell you how the different steps of getting the code contents looks like. And this is the first step. This is how you compose your authenticate, your authorized, your redirect link to get redirected to the Google to get the token. What are the parts of this? I will tell you something about these parts because that will give you idea how the standard works. Like first thing you have to supply is client ID. Client ID is a unique identification of your client application. It always works in the way when you use the external provider that first you have to register your application with that external provider. So I have to go, when I want to use the Google, I have to go to Google portal and say I'm application developer and I register my application. I give Google my application name, and the Google generates a couple of things for me. One of them is client ID. This is unique identification of my application. Then I need to tell Google in my redirect where I want to be redirected back after I get authenticated with the Google. And in response type, I will say what type of the flow I want to use. I will get to this later, but OpenID Connect has a few flows. Every flow is suitable for different scenario. I will explain later. And in scope, I will also say what type of the information I ask back. And here I'm saying I'm using OpenID, and that just means that I always get the ID of the user, subject ID back. But on top of it, I also want the user's email, and I want the user's profile. And by profile, the standard means the personal information like first name, second name, your picture, or whatever the provider has about you. And the state and nonce, it's not important. It's about this flow, but I will not go into the detail of this flow because I will show you the flows which are recommended these days. So I will actually show you what happened when I use this link. Let me just copy that link to the browser. So you see I get redirected to the Google, to the sign-in page. And here, because Google knows about my application, it already displays to the user what kind of application he's providing the credentials for. So you know the user knows that this is the application which is asking for the access. So I fill my credentials, my password. Sorry. Well, it's a demo account, so you wouldn't get anything with that. and I got redirected back to that URI I supplied. There is nothing running. I have no application running here, so that's why it shows the site can't be reached, because that local host I supply as a redirect URI, there is nothing running. But for this demo is not important, because what's important, what I wanted to show you is what I get back. Let's see what I got back in that redirect link. I get back some stuff, but most important stuff is I get back something which is called the ID token in that URL. Let me just find where it finish. I think it finished here. So I get a couple of things in redirect in query string, but this is the important things. This is the ID token, and this is that ID card, like the občanka. Yeah, this is what contains the information about the user, and the format here is JSON Web Token. JSON Web Token is a standard which is independent of OpenID Connect, but OpenID Connect uses it for some situation, like for ID token, it always uses the JSON Web Token. And JSON Web Token is actually JSON, which has 3 parts. It has a header, it has information itself, and it has a signature. And you know, it's a JSON, and you remove the white spaces. Then all the characters you translate to UTF byte array, and then you encode base64 that byte array, and you get this token. So it's not encryption. This is the open. So I can actually take this, and I can look what's inside the token. Oh, sorry. Thanks. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. So I can actually go to the JSON Web Token site, which is called like this. It provides you a lot of documentation about the JSON Web Tokens. It actually provides quite a good book, which tells you all the details you know about the JSON Web Token. And one thing which also provides is this debugger. I can copy my token here, and I will get displayed what's inside the token. And you see on the left side, it colored the 3 different parts I told you about. First part is header. It's just saying, oh, I'm JSON W token, and this bit, this RS256, it says I'm using the asymmetrical signature. I will explain later. And this is actually the payload, what's inside. This is what Google tells me about my identity. So you can see here that subject, that's the unique ID of the user. This is what I get because I ask for OpenID profile, scope, and this is the profile information. I get the email scope, and this is the profile scope. I get the name, picture, given name, family name, what's my language. I also get the expiry of the JSON Web Token. Typically, JSON Web Token has a limited lifetime. And yes, some of the a lot of fields are standardized, and you can add your own. Most of them, which you see here, are actually from the standard. So in standard, you get I think almost all of them. Maybe given name, family name is custom, and picture, but everything else is in the standard. You remember I told you that you must make sure that the user cannot change the token. So to protect the token from change, this payload is actually signed, and the signature is the last bit of this. And it's signed, in this case, it's signed by asymmetrical encryption by private public key. It means that the Google signs the payload by its private key, and you can use Google public key to verify the signature. So that's by this way, no one, like, if you take this token, you modify to be someone else, it wouldn't work, because the application will verify your token and will find out that the signature doesn't match. So that was the Google example. Obviously now, like, if I continue with this flow, I would use I would verify the signature, and I would use the information from the token to do whatever I need in my single page application. But for this demo, it's enough. I will return to the presentation. I will just go back to our scenario, because I told you that I want to detail like 2 major flows in OpenID Connect we can use to secure this scenario. So what I actually done, like, I prepared ASP.NET Core solution, or .NET Core solution for this. I prepared the demo application which has these components. I will just quickly show you the demo application, which we can walk through. It's application which has, I don't know, I hope you can see it. It has 2 APIs, like on the picture. It has a single page client, and it has a MVC client. And they talk exactly in that way as in a diagram. So when I run the application, it will run 4 components. Now nothing is protected. Now everything is open. And in my presentation, I'll show you how to secure this application. So this is the single page application. If I click this button, it will call API 1 and gets the information back. If I click the second button, it will call API 1, and API 1 will call API 2. So you get information from API 2 and API 1. It's just completely fabricated example, but it shows you the what was on the picture. And now everything is open. Anyone can go to this application, and one call API. And what we want to do, we want to secure this stuff. I'll switch it off for now. Back to the. So actually, the OpenID Connect and OAuth 2 is all about the steps you have to implement to communicate with your identity provider and to get the tokens back. And for depending on type of the application, it gives you different flows. In OpenID Connect, it's called flow. In OAuth 2, it's called grant. I would use flow, but just when you see just pure OAuth standard, you will probably see the grant, but don't be confused there. So there are these types of the grants and these types of the flows in the standard. And if you go to the standard, it will tell you if you use the authorization code grant, you use this link, you connect to that redirect link has these options. You use these options, and then you get back the token, and then you have to do these things with the token. And depending on the application, the steps are slightly different. As I mentioned, these flows are different for different application type. And originally, until the end of the last year, these were the recommendation for different type of the application. The recommendation was for single page application used something called implicit flow. For a server-based web application, it doesn't have to be MVC, or just for the web apps, use this type of flow. For mobile apps, this one. For machine to machine, this one. That was up to last year. You will still see it in many websites, because that was recommended until quite recently. But now these days, they actually improve one of these flows called authorization code. They extended it with something they called PKCE, which is proof key code for exchange. And the authors or OpenID Connect now saying you can use this flow for all this type of user-facing applications, or So you can use this single flow for single page application, web apps, and mobile apps as well. And for machine to machine, the recommendation is same as in past. Use the client credential grant. So in my next part of the presentation, I'll show you how you can implement these flows. Any question to this? This is the end of the first section.
Authenticate, you need use the whole key as you described, including the email and everything. So when you ask for more information, then there is more traffic, or you can use just a part of it.
Well, actually, I will show you in on this authorization code. It's a bit more complex. In a few minutes, I'll show you the steps what you have to do. But you're right, you will not get everything in the first redirect. You have to ask for more information. That's the part of the flow I show you in a couple of minutes. Was that the question? Yeah? Yeah, okay. You know, as an identity server, I used Google in the first demo. In this demo, I will use something which is called Identity Server 4. It's an identity provider which you can use in your, if you want to, you can implement your own identity provider. Identity server is NuGet, and you can use this NuGet either to extend your existing project to make OpenID Connect provider with it, or you can create a completely new project. You can use the templates which are part of the which are on the Git as well, and you can create your own identity provider. And that identity provider, it's a ASP.NET Core application, and you can use different parts and you can configure it in different way. It's very customizable. But you know, if you don't want to use for some reason external provider like Google or Microsoft Azure, you need to do something special. For example, you have already your own users or you have your database. You can use the identity server. So identity server, it's a NuGet which you add to your project or you create a new one. It's open source. It's certified by OpenID Foundation. OpenID Foundation are the guys who are behind the OpenID Connect, and they have a certification process to make sure that if someone claims they implement OpenID Connect, they make sure that it's true, that they certify them. Identity server is also part of .NET Foundation, you know, which is organization which promotes open source in .NET. And important thing is it's Apache 2 license, so you can use identity server for your commercial needs. It's no problem with that, using it on a commercial project. And I will use this identity server, I will show you as an identity provider. So now to the first flow, which I want to show you, which will cover pretty much all your application which are facing the user, and it's called authorization code flow with proof key for code exchange. If you look into the standard, you can read about it from the standard, but it's quite it's not very easy to read, but it's the ultimate source of the truth, right? But you can also use, I give you another link here, which is actually for software called Okta. Okta is some kind of software which is identity provider as a service. You can use it. I don't use Okta, but they have a very good documentation for the flows. And that's actually a good tip, like, you know, these providers, you don't have to use their product, but they will describe the OpenID Connect, which is a standard, so you can use it, the knowledge anywhere else. They can provide much better documentation or learning resources than the standard itself. And now on this diagram, you can see what's happening during the authorization code flow with Pixie. It's a bit complex. I don't want to go through the details. You don't need to know the details. You have the link in the presentation, and it's not important to know all the details at this point. But basically, it works in the way that it makes getting the tokens more secure than what you see with the Google. You know what you've seen with the Google? I just redirect to the Google, and back I get the token in a redirect URL. But actually, that's not a very secure way how you get back the tokens, because URL is typically recorded in different network components, in log files. It's also part of the browsing history. So if you have a browser with some extensions which can look into your history, they can get hold of your tokens. So that flow is not very safe, actually, because the tokens are passed in redirect. So they don't recommend this flow anymore, and they recommend this one without it. And in short, basically, this flow, the idea is that you do the redirect as before, but instead of getting tokens back, you get a code, unique code back, and then in independent AJAX call, you exchange that code with identity provider for the tokens. And on top of it, there is this additional authentication using this proof key. It's not important to go through details. If you know how the steps exactly are, I just recommend reading this. I'll show you how to implement it without even knowing all these details. So that will be my second presentation. I will switch to my sample, my demo sample. And what I want to do, actually, I want to this is my very advanced single page application. This is the complete application, and now it's not protected at all. So you know, when I run it, I don't know who is the user, because there is no authentication. So now in this single page application, I want to use the identity server to do authentication for me. I have an identity server here as well, and you can see it's just a simple ASP.NET Core project, and I got a flavor which actually has some test users inside. But you can get different flavors of identity server depending on what template you use. You can get the completely new one and implement your own UI, or you might use the identity server just for machine to machine. In this case, you wouldn't have any UI. You would have just some registration for the client ID and client credentials. So at the moment, my identity server is completely empty. It just have 2 test users, but it's not ready to receive any authentication request. You remember at the beginning I mentioned that typically when you want to use some identity provider, you have to go and you have to register with that identity provider. So you have to do the same here. In order my single page application to use this identity server, I have to register it. The identity server must know about it. In a simple development scenario, you can use just overload of these functions or define these functions to do it, but it's a flexible system. You can have your registration in database or whatever. You don't need to have them in the code, or you can have them in JSON. I will just choose the simplest scenario when I define my clients in the code. So first thing I have to do is I have to define my single page client I want to use. I will just quickly stop here and explain what's happening. Like now I'm telling the identity server to be ready to accept the authentication request from client, which is called SPA client. I assign it with this ID. And this guy is allowed to talk to me with using authorization code with Pixie. And these are the redirect URIs the client is allowed to ask. Maybe you get confused why I have to tell which URIs are, why I have to specify them here as well, because you know, as a client, I'm already sending them in authentication request. But this is another layer of the security. It just like it means that some different client would not be able to ask for authentication and be redirected somewhere else, then it's registered here. So imagine it's just like extra security. And the same is for logout. I will implement the logout as well. And because I'm using the single page application, I have to configure cores on the server. And another thing, I tell during the registration what scopes the client application is allowed to ask for. So in our example, I will allow the application to ask for ID user. So this is this Open ID scope and profile. I will give away whatever I have from the profile. So I configured my client. Sorry, I configured my identity server. I have extra. I will run it. My identity server is running. And now I want to go to my single page application, and I want to implement this type of the flow we've seen in here. I don't want to do this in JavaScript, like to implement something like this. Unfortunately, I don't have to do that. There is a lot of libraries you can use, and because it's a standard, so someone done the job for you. So for JavaScript clients, the most commonly used there is already some library which is developed, and the most commonly used is called OEDC client, and I will use this one. I show you how to use it, and I don't have to worry about this flow. The library will implement the flow for me.
Now the redirect is from the resource owner to the client application. So
yeah, well, sorry, it's a bit confusing. Resource owner is the user.
But the authorization server has no say in how the redirect happens, because it's not the authorization server who does the redirection, it's the resource owner itself. So
well, it's
yeah, it's the browser is doing.
Yeah, it's exactly the same. Yeah, it's exactly the same what I shown you with the Google. The stat is the same. Just what differs is that when you get the redirect back, you don't get the tokens. You get the code back, and then you have to do some extra stuff with this code to get the tokens. And on top of it, there is this proof key flow, which is these other yellow guys. But actually, if I use that library, I don't have to worry about that, because library will implement it for me. Yeah, that library is called OIDC client. I hope you can see that. So I will just add it to my application using libman, which is some stuff to get JavaScript libraries. And I will modify a bit of my page. I just need to add login buttons. And I include the script into my page, and I need to modify the JavaScript as well, right? So when I go to my JavaScript, I will not type it, I will just copy it, but I explain what happened here. I just added handlers for this login and logout button, but I don't implement that flow. I will use the library. And the idea behind the library is that you call something which is, you call an object which is called the user manager, and during the initialization of the application, you will tell the object the parameters you need to communicate with identity provider, right? And these parameters are URL to that identity provider. My identity server is running on port 5000. I have to identify myself. This is the client ID I was assigned during my registration. I want to redirect back to this. This is where I'm running. And the logout will be redirected here as well. Remember that this must match the URL which you put into the registration, another security layer. I'm saying here that I want to use the authorization code flow, and I'm asking for OpenID and for profile. And if identity provider is configured in the way that it allows what I want here, it will let me through. So let's run it and see. So now, yeah, and I forgot to say one important thing. After I configure my user manager, I just hang my buttons on methods of that user manager, and that user manager has a method for login, for logout, and for getting the tokens. That's what you need. So you're not involved in the flow, you declaratively say where you want to connect, and then use the method on the user management to implement login, logout, and whatever you need. And you don't care about the rest. Yeah, okay, so when I call login, you see I'm redirected to identity server, and I was already logged. Sorry, I will log out because you wouldn't see what was happening. No, I played with it before and I log in already, so you wouldn't see what's happening. So okay, so I will get out now. I will restart it. Oh, not this one, sorry. Yeah, now you see I'm redirected to identity provider, which is identity server. I told you that it was configured with some test users, so I will use the test user. I will log in, and I will get what I've done in my application is that I just display what I get back from that user manager. So what user manager done was actually it implemented all the flows which you've seen in the diagram, and it get back ID token for me, access token for me, and this is the decoded information from the token. If you want to actually see what was happening, let's try again. And I will just open the console. Show the network. I do log in. Look, the first thing what happened was that my single page application, or actually that library, contacted the identity server and asked for something called OpenID configuration. Now OpenID configuration is actually, when I get this, it's actually JSON which is exposed by identity provider. This is standard. So if I put this address to Google or Microsoft Azure or whatever, it will display this document as well. And it just provides the information about the identity provider in terms of where different endpoints on that identity provider and what identity provider supplies in terms of what flows it implements. So when I in my single page application, when I specify the authority here, what the library did is it contacted the OpenID configuration to get all the URLs it will need for the implement all the flow. So when I come back here and I will continue, you will see that in in the back scene some other calls were happening, and you can see that after I get the configuration, the library actually asked for like different things. It contacted like a different it contacted this endpoint to get this token, and they then did some another calls, and basically these calls, I will not go through the details, but these calls is actually the implementation of what you've seen on the picture. So that was done by the library for you, so you don't have to implement this. So at the moment what I've done is I implemented and I go back to my presentation. I implemented this part, yeah. I have a single page application, and I use the identity server to get the ID token back. Now the second part I want to do is I want to get the access token as well, and I want to use this access token to access the API. So this will be, because now when the API one, I only know who the user is, but the API one is still not protected. Anyone can call it. So let's protect the API too, so no one can call it. You know this. I put authorize here. And so now only authorized requests get through. But obviously I have to configure the application in startup. I have to say what type of authorization I'm using. Again, like you can, because it's a standard, you can go and you can read the standard and you can implement using the steps in the standard. You can implement all the things you have to do in authorization when you get the token, or you will use the external library. And in my case, I will use the external library again. I don't want to implement it myself. And I did a mistake here. I wanted to secure this guy actually, so let's secure it. And OpenID Connect to protect your API, use the JSON Web Tokens, which were issued by OpenID Connect provider. And to use the JSON Web Tokens, you can use a generic package implemented by Microsoft, which is called JSON WT Bearer. And it would actually work with a token issued by anyone. It doesn't have to be OpenID Connect provider. If you create your own token, you can use this software as well. But if you use the OpenID Connect and you use the provider, you can use this package to implement full flow for using the token as well. So now I have to configure the startup as well. So first thing I have to do is I have to configure this I have to configure this provider, and here I'm saying, look, I'm using JSON Web Tokens, which are issued by this guy, and this guy is identity server. and I need to when I use the authorize attribute, I obviously have to add use authentication and use authorization to my pipeline as well. I didn't have it before, but with authorize attribute you have to add these components there. An important bit you should not forget is because it was single page application and I had to configure cores. If I use the bear token, I have to configure cores not just for the URL, but I also have to allow any header, meaning that the cores work with the clients sending any header, because it will use the tokens. Otherwise, that wouldn't work, and the cores, the browser, would reject the request if you don't do this. And now I can try to run it. Let me set this up. I will just wanna I will run client single page and I will run API 1. Let's run it. You can see that I cannot call my API directly anymore. I get the 401, so it's protected, right? So this is the URL, direct URL to my API doesn't work anymore unless I send a token. And let's try oh, sorry, and one important thing I forgot is I have to obviously use the token in my single page application to access the API. I haven't done this yet. So I will go to my single page application. I will find where I'm calling that external API. That external API is called here. And I will just change it that when I call get on that application, I will also add the authorization header and I supply the access token. And the access token I got from that user manager JavaScript library. So let's log in. I got the token back. Now I want to call API. And I got some type of, I got 401. Why did I get 401? I included the access token. Sometimes when you play with the identity server and you think it should work and it doesn't work, what is very useful is you can look into the identity server console, which is this one, and it will normally tell you what's wrong, why it didn't work. So let's see what identity server, why it rejected our call here. You see what was happening, like me as a client, I was asking for OpenID configuration. I should have an error here. Why don't I have an error here? Let's look into my... Oh, actually it's... sorry, I made a mistake. It will be... I will find what's wrong in my API. It's not just identity server, which will give you a lot of errors, but if something happened, but it also the provider in API. If something goes wrong, you can look into the log file and see if something went wrong. So I can see here that when I try to, when the token arrives and my JWT handler tried to verify the token, it didn't like it, and there is reason here why it didn't like it. And it's saying here that it didn't like the audience which was in the token. And I would like to just give a few explanation here. When your API gets the token by OpenID Connect standard, it must do some verification on the token. By default, it verifies a couple of things. First, it verifies if the token didn't expire. This is not our case. The second thing which verifies and which is mandatory is the signature. So, like, the token was not modified, by the way, or malicious user didn't change it. And the third things which the middleware checks is something called audience. And this guy is telling me that I have a wrong audience. And audience basically means that inside the token, you have the information for which this token is intended. So I have to say, the provider have to give me the token, which is just for my application, and I cannot use some other application to get the token and then go back to another application and use it. Yeah. So for this, you have to verify that the token is actually for that application which is supposed to be. So to get this working, what I have to do is I have to go to my identity provider. And the identity provider has a notion of something called API resources. And API resources is also that audience I will need in my token. And, sorry. Now, I will add what I'm saying here is that there is API called API1, and it's a resource I want to protect. So the identity server knows that it must protect this API. Next thing I have to do is I have to tell in client registration that the client is entitled to ask for resource. So do you understand this notion? Like identity server is now telling, look, I protect API 1, I list it in here, and the client called with client ID SPA is allowed to ask for that resource. So I configured the identity server. I will run it. I will go now to API startup again. This is the configuration of token verification. I will specify, sorry, I have to, that's a bit more complex. New token validation, and I have to specify so now my API authentication or authorization configuration is saying when the token arrives, please check that it has API 1 in the token. So I configured identity server, I configured API 1. And now the last things I have to do is I have to go to my single page application, to the configuration here, and I have to ask for this scope. So now what will be happening is when I connect to identity provider for my single page, I will tell identity provider I want to authenticate and I want to get access token for API 1. And the identity provider knows that I'm entitled to get access for that, so it will issue token with API 1 in audience. And when the token arrives in API 1 server, it will find that in the token and it will let me in. So when I run now everything, what happened? I think my AP1 is so okay. Let's start it again. Okay, it was not switch off. So let's try again, third time. Okay, it looks like it's up and running. I will log in. Interesting thing what you can see here now, the identity provider is telling me, or it's telling the user, look, you know, the application which you're using is asking for your user identifier for your profile, and it also asking for the access to this API. So user knows that's another layer of the protection. As a user, I have to allow that. I will get the token. Now, if I decrypt, or if I translate this token into human readable form, I will actually find out that in the token I have API 1 permission, and when I call it now, I should succeed. And I didn't succeed. Why didn't I succeed? Because I'm not running. Okay. Oh, the API 1 is not running. No, it's not running. Let's start it separately. Why is it not running? Okay. Okay. Again, login. Yep, and I could call the API successfully now with the token. So when I get to the presentation, now we are in this stage that we secured the SPA clients, get the ID token, can find out all the information about the user, and it will get the access token, and we protect the API with that access token. So that was the second block of the presentation, and the last block, which should be the shorter one. But if you're not interested, you can leave. It's about how to secure the API to API with a client credentials flow. This is slightly different scenario. With machine to machine, you don't have any user, and machine to machine is a secure scenario. Like machine to machine is able to keep the secret because it's a server component. It's not like a browser application where you cannot have any secrets in browser application because malicious user can see that. So in machine-to-machine, you can use something which is called client credentials grant. It's very simple flow. Basically, you register your application with which is in this case it's API 1. You register with identity provider, and the identity provider issues client credentials for you, and the client credentials are your client ID and secret. And when you want to access API 2, you ask identity provider for the access token. You supply your client credentials, identity provider give you the access token, and then you use the access token to connect to API 2. So let's show this demo. I will close all these, we don't need these. I have here. Sorry for a little break. Okay. So at the moment, my API 2 is not protected. So again, I have to go to control. I have to say authorize. That's the first thing I have to do. Second thing is that again, exactly like before, because I use the authorized, I have to in startup I have to configure my authorization provider. So I will go, like in previous step, I will go to I will use the same library. It's the same principle. I use the same library because I will be using tokens again. API 2 doesn't care who is token from, as long as it can validate it. And yeah, exactly like before, I will do the startup the same way. You know, this type, the audience is API 2, because I want this to be different token. Again, I have to configure the authentication and authorization. This is machine to machine, there is no course. Because I use the different audience, I have to do the same thing like for API 1. I will go to the identity server. I will add the identifier for my API 2. And now I need to add my client registration. But the client this time is not SPA, but it's an API. So let's add another client registration. I will explain what's happening here. This is the client. This is the new client registration. The client ID I assigned, it's called API 1. This is its name. But this time, the allowed grant types is called client credentials because it's machine-to-machine configuration. And I have to, as an identity provider, I have to generate a secret for the user. This is in a developer configuration. It's done in this primitive way, which is not obviously safe because you have a secrets in your code. You wouldn't do this in reality, but this is for the demo purposes. So I created client credentials for my client, where client ID is API 1 and the secret is secret. And the allowed scopes, what the client API 1 is allowed, he's allowed to ask for the access to API 2. So this is the notion of that. So now I configured the identity provider to be able to handle the client credentials. So I can run it. Next thing, I already protected and configured my API 2. And next thing I have to do is I have to go to API 1, to the place where I call API 2. This is the original code. You know, in here I just create HTTP client through the HTTP client factory. This is the proper way how you get the HTTP clients. And then I just simply call get on that API 2, and I deserialize the information. And now I have to change this code. I want to get the token from the identity provider and use this token in the call. And again, because it's a standard, I can study the protocols and I can implement the step of communicating with identity provider on my own, or I use some library which done it for me. And obviously there is many libraries which can do it for me. I will use the standard library which is called, I forgot, tell you exactly. Oh, it's called the identity model. It's actually a library which is created by the same guys who created identity server, but this NuGet is for your client application. They can use this library to implement the client credentials on the client side. And then I have to modify using my code here. Sorry. Okay. This is yeah, basically in my HTTP client code. What I have to do, I need to get the token, and then I have to use this token back. So when you look into my original method, now I slightly modify it. That before I do the get, I set the authorization header, and in authorization header I provide a access token. And to get the access token, you use the library of identity provider, and it's done in this way. You supply the HTTP client, you get the object called discovery document back. Basically, you specify the URL of your identity provider, and then on that document discovery, you can run different methods. And one of the methods you can run on it is getting the access token using the client credentials. So in here, I tell, okay, please connect me to this guy. This is the identity provider, and get access token. Here are my client ID and client secret. And on the way back, I will get the access token, and I will use the access token in HTTP call. So when I run now everything, I should be able to see that API 2 is protected now. So you can see this is API 1, it's still protected. This is API 2. Now it's protected as well. I get 401 because I didn't supply token. I will log in. And now one thing I forgot is, oh no, sorry, no, nothing. Yeah. Single page application is accessing only API 1, so it needs only API 1 scope. And it's API 2, which is, it's API 1 itself, which is accessing API 2. It has nothing to do with the single page application. So when I call this second button, you remember at the beginning I told you the second button calls API 1 and API 1 calls API 2. So let's see if I get through. And you can see now I get through. This is the answer from API 1, and this is the answer I got from API 2. So this is the client credentials flows. So that's pretty much all for the demos. You've seen two main scenarios: how to secure a client application which facing the users, and how you secure the machine to machine. When I get to last slide, which has only the references, probably switch them. Yeah, these are the references. All you know, the samples I shown you, I put into the accessible DevOps Git. Sorry, I have to use the GitHub as everyone, but I didn't get to it yet. So in DevOps, but anyway, it's a Git as any other Git, and it has a couple of commits, and the commits you would see there is what you have to add in the steps I show in the presentation. So this sample has like a different commits, and you can see what I explain here. Like in first commit, I just add the baseline solution which didn't have any protection. In the second commit, I added the identity server. In third commit, I added authentication to single page. So you can see here how to modify the JavaScript application to get the ID token, what you have to do. And in another commit, you can see how you can use the token you get to send it to API and authorize with API. And the last commit will show you the one before the end will show you the client credentials. That's the scenario we went through now. And the last commit, I knew that there would be no time for it, but it's not important to explain it here. But just if you're interested, I show you at the beginning on the demo sample the single page application and MVC application. So in the last commit, you can see what you can do to get authentication if you have an MVC application. Again, like you use the same authorization code for Pixie flow, but you don't want to implement it itself, use the library, and everything is healed from this commit. So that's pretty much all I wanted to say about OpenID Connect. You know, you can the big thing about OpenID Connect is that almost everyone is using it now. So typically, when you want to access some API and it's some modern company which want to use the modern stuff, they would use the OpenID Connect. We get quite a lot of experience in our project for, you know, Avarda, for the Swedish bank. They use a lot of external providers where we have to authorize. And in past, like every provider has some kind of custom authorization protocol, but now they are switching to OpenID Connect, and almost all of them are switched to OpenID Connect as well. So it's important to know, you know, because a lot of providers will probably ask you to use this if you want to use them. That's one thing. And another scenario where you use it in our project was, for example, we already learned how to use the OpenID Connect. So when we needed to implement it, some authentication method using some external provider, which didn't use the IP OpenID Connect, what we did was that we included our identity server. That identity server did this custom communication with external provider, but for our application, it was OpenID Connect. So that's how you can use, for example, the identity server if you want to convert some non-standard protocol to OpenID Connect. That's the identity server good for as well. I think that's pretty much all. I will send you I will add the presentation to the Slack, and you have access to the code. So everything I've shown is can be seen to the code. So if you need to use the OpenID Connect, this is good start. There is much more to it. So once you get through it, you can see like slightly different flavors of the stuff I shown you. For example, for one of the bank, we have to use the encrypted form of the JSON Web Token. It's quite special thing, but you can. It's in the standard as well. and there is much more stuff. So when you get into these protocols, you might need to learn more stuff, but this is the basic idea of how it works, and it can set you, to use it in real life. Any questions?
The pull request, I have seen a lot of commits with pull requests.
I actually did my pull request, but it was different Git, and I just I just uploaded the Git to the public Git, and you don't get a pull request with that, right? But the commits, and the presentation is enough. It's not that hard, and you will find a lot of documentation for these libraries. Like Identity Server has very good documentation. And as I said, like sometimes it's not easy to use the standard itself, but you can cheat and you can go to third-party provider which implements OpenID Connect. You don't have to use their product, but you can use their documentation. And this Okta is one, and another one is called Out2. I think I put it into the link. Yeah. Sorry. This Out0, it's another provider which provides OpenID Connect as a service. And again, you don't have to use them, but they have very good description how the flow works, and you can just use the documentation to learn from it, because it's hard to read the standards. The standards, the specification, they are here, and this link is that's very simple. Couple of pages introduction into OpenID Connect. Just be careful, like you would still see like a lot of documentation and recommendation for these flows I shown you that they obsolete. You should not the official OpenID Connect. The recommendation is to use these two flows I shown you, and these are just there for the historical reasons. That's why I didn't even describe them. But obviously sometimes not all the identity provider provides this new authorization code with the Pixie. I think, for example, with the Google I couldn't find it. They still use the implicit flow. So you might run into a situation that you cannot use that new one, but you would have to use the old one. If you have any questions later on, just send me the email or ask on the Slack. Is there anything on the Slack or? Okay.
So, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks.